very same cave, different versions of the same book. That is Noam Mizrahi, professor of biblical studies at Tel Aviv University, describing what was actually stored in the caves above the Dead Sea. Not two different books, the same book in two different forms, sitting side by side, kept by people who seem to have found nothing strange about that at all. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest biblical manuscripts on Earth. For more than 70 years, the only thing anyone could do with them was read them. Then, a team of scientists stopped reading the words. They sequenced the DNA of the pages instead. Because the animal skins these texts were written on were still carrying a genetic record, 2,000 years after the animals died. And that record did not match the story in the textbooks. Where did these scrolls actually come from? Who made them? And what does that tell us about the Bible, before anyone had decided what the Bible was? This is what the DNA revealed. But to understand why a strand of DNA could unsettle 2,000 years of assumption, you have to go back to the moment none of this was supposed to be found at all. The cliffs along the northwest shore of the Dead Sea are the color of old bone. There is almost no soil. The air above the water carries salt. It is the lowest exposed land on the planet, and it is one of the driest places in the Middle East. That dryness is the only reason any of this survived. Sometime in 1946 or 1947, a young herder from the Ta'amira Bedouin was moving animals through those cliffs. The accounts differ in their details, which is what usually happens when a story becomes famous after the fact. In the version most often repeated, he threw a stone into a cave opening and heard pottery break. Inside were tall clay jars with bowl-shaped lids. Inside those, wrapped in linen, were leather scrolls. They were not recognized as treasure. They were recognized as goods. And this is the first thing worth sitting with, because it shaped everything that followed. The scrolls entered the antiquities market before they ever entered a laboratory. They passed through Bethlehem dealers, were split into separate lots, and were sold to separate buyers. Nobody in that chain had any commercial reason to record where a given piece had been lying or what it had been lying next to. The value was in the object. The context was worthless. So the single most useful piece of information about each fragment, its position on a cave floor, was gone before the first scholar was called. Which is why, 70 years later, someone would have to go looking for that information inside the parchment itself. One of these fragments would eventually be traced to an animal that could not have lived anywhere near this desert. But that would take another lifetime to discover. In late November of 1947, a professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University named Eleazar Sukenik took a phone call from an Armenian dealer he knew. There was something he ought to see. Jerusalem at that moment was coming apart. The British mandate was weeks from expiring. The city was cut by barbed wire and improvised barricades, and the two men could not simply meet. So they met at a fence at the edge of a military zone, and the dealer held a piece of leather up against the wire. Sukenik looked at the letters through the barbed wire and recognized the shapes. They resembled the inscriptions he knew from first-century bone boxes in Jerusalem. That was enough. He understood immediately that whatever this was, it was not medieval, and it was not a forgery of a familiar kind. 5 days later, he arranged a pass, ignored the warnings, ignored his wife and his son, and traveled into Bethlehem to see the rest. He came back on a public bus, the scrolls wrapped in paper on his lap, an ordinary parcel among ordinary passengers. At home, alone, he unrolled one of them. He wrote in his diary, "My hands shook as I started to unwrap one of them." He read a few lines. The Hebrew was beautiful and old, close to the language of the Psalms, but the text itself was one he had never seen. He recorded the feeling that came over him then, that he had been handed, by nothing but luck of timing, a Hebrew scroll that no one had read in 2,000 years. That same evening, the radio carried the result of the United Nations vote on the partition of Palestine. He had bought 3 scrolls that day. Among them were the work now called the War Scroll and the collection of hymns known as the Thanksgiving Psalms. I keep returning to that image of a man on a bus with a parcel on his knees. Not because it is dramatic, because it is the exact opposite of how we imagine great discoveries arriving. Over the next decade, 11 caves in the area around Qumran gave up their contents. The total, once everything had been counted, came to more than 25,000 fragments, the remains of roughly 1,000 separate manuscripts. The oldest go back to the 3rd century before the Common Era. The latest were made shortly before the Roman army came through in the year 68 of the Common Era. They included the oldest known copies of books of the Hebrew Bible. And immediately there was a question nobody could answer. Who put them there? The answer arrived quickly, and it arrived from Sukenik himself. Among the first scrolls he read was a text laying out the rules of a disciplined religious community, property held in common, ranked membership, an initiation period, a strict internal code. Sukenik connected it to a group described by ancient writers as the Essenes. There was an obvious reason to make that connection. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, had described a community of Essenes living on the western side of the Dead Sea, apart from the world. Josephus and Philo described the group as well. Here were their rules, apparently, in a cave on that exact shore. Then the archaeology seemed to confirm it. Between 1951 and 1956, a Dominican priest named Roland de Vaux of the French Biblical and Archaeological School in Jerusalem excavated the ruin at Khirbet Qumran, a short walk from the caves. He found a settlement. He found water channels and a series of stepped pools that looked like ritual baths. He found a cemetery with over 1,000 graves, and he found a long room containing plastered benches or tables, along with inkwells. He identified that room as a scriptorium, a place where scribes worked. From those pieces, a picture assembled itself, and it was a good picture. A separatist community withdraws into the desert. It lives by the rules found in the caves. It copies scripture year after year in the long room with the inkwells. Then the Roman legions move down the Jordan Valley, and the community carries its library up into the cliffs, seals it in jars, and never comes back. Every element supported every other element. The site explained the scrolls, and the scrolls explained the site. It is worth saying plainly that this was not a careless theory. It was built by serious people from real evidence, and it accounted for more of the data than anything else on offer. That is precisely what makes what happens next interesting. Within a decade, it was the standard account. It went into textbooks. It went into museum captions. It is still today the version most people have heard. And here is where a theory stops being only a theory. The team de Vaux assembled to publish the fragments was small, and its access was exclusive. For roughly 4 decades, the great majority of the unpublished material could be read only by that group and the people they invited. Scholars outside it could not check a reading, could not propose an alternative join, could not test the framework against the evidence because they were not permitted to see the evidence. The mechanism there is simple, and it is not unique to this field. Whoever controls access to primary material controls which interpretations are possible. That arrangement did not break down until 1991, when a library in California released its photographic archive of the scrolls to any qualified researcher. A facsimile edition appeared in print, and the publication project was restructured under new leadership. For the first time, the consensus could be argued with by people who had not helped build it. And for 40 years, that was the answer, until people started counting. Start with the arithmetic. The settlement at Qumran was not large. Estimates of how many people lived there at any one time vary, but they are generally measured in dozens, not hundreds. The library those dozens supposedly produced runs to roughly 1,000 manuscripts. Copying a scroll by hand is slow, expensive work. It requires prepared skins, prepared ink, trained hands, and time measured in months per book. A community of that size producing a library of that size is not impossible, but it is a strain. Then came the handwriting. When scholars began sorting the fragments by scribal hand, the individual unrepeatable habits that identify one copyist from another, the count kept climbing. Norman Golb of the University of Chicago put the figure at around 500 distinct hands. 500 scribes, for a settlement of dozens. Here is what I find striking. That number does not disprove anything on its own, but it changes the shape of the question. You are no longer asking how a small community wrote a large library. You are asking whether a small community wrote it at all. Then came the contents. The scrolls are not doctrinally consistent. Some texts use the specific vocabulary of a closed sect, the rules, the internal hierarchy, the language of a community set apart. Others do not. The liturgical work known as the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, found in multiple copies at Qumran, lacks the sectarian markers almost entirely. And there are texts in the collection whose ideas sit uncomfortably beside each other. Different calendars, different legal positions, different assumptions about the priesthood. A library assembled by one community with one rulebook does not usually look like that. Then came what was missing. Among 25,000 fragments, there are almost no documentary texts, no letters, no contracts, no lists of who owed what to whom. Any settlement that operates for a century generates paperwork, and this collection has essentially none of it. What it has instead is literature, copies of literary and religious works, which is what a library looks like, not what a working community's archive looks like. My own reading is that the absence is the loudest evidence in the whole collection. Objects that are present can be explained several ways. Objects that should be present and are not tend to have only one explanation. The one striking exception is the copper scroll from the third cave, a list of hidden treasure engraved on metal, describing quantities that would be extraordinary for a desert commune, and describing locations that appear to point toward Jerusalem. Out of that, alternatives were built. In the 1960s, Karl Heinrich Rengstorff at the University of Münster proposed that the scrolls came from the Library of the Temple in Jerusalem. From 1980 onward, Norman Golb argued for something broader, that the scrolls were the remains of multiple Jerusalem libraries, belonging to different Jewish groups, evacuated into the desert as the Roman army closed on the city. And notice what is actually at stake in that disagreement, because it is not a quarrel about geography. If the scrolls are sectarian, they are evidence about a fringe. Anything strange in them can be filed as the peculiarity of a small, isolated group, and mainstream Jewish practice in the period stands untouched. If the scrolls are not sectarian, they are evidence about the mainstream. Every strange thing in them becomes evidence about what ordinary Jewish religious life actually contained in the last centuries before the temple burned. The label decides in advance what the entire collection is allowed to prove. That is not a small thing to leave unresolved. And it must be said clearly, the Qumran hypothesis is not dead, and it was not dead then. A large body of scholars continued to hold it, and continue to hold it now, on the strength of the site itself, the baths, the cemetery, the inkwells, and the presence of sectarian rule texts in the caves closest to the settlement. This is a live argument among serious people, not a solved case with holdouts. The trouble was that neither side could win it, not with the tools available. To see why, you have to look at what was physically on the table. 25,000 fragments, most of them small, many of them the size of a fingernail, darkened, brittle, warped by 2,000 years in a cave and then by decades of handling. Reassembling them is the largest jigsaw puzzle in the history of archaeology, with 2 additional cruelties. Nobody knows how many separate puzzles are mixed together in the box, and most of the pieces are missing. The traditional methods are exactly what you would expect. Match the physical edges. Match the ruling lines scored into the skin. Match the handwriting. Match the ink. Each of those works, and each of them fails at scale. Edges crumble. Ruling lines are common to many scrolls. 2 scribes trained in the same period write similarly enough to fool anyone. And a wrong join is not a harmless error. It silently invents a sentence that never existed by placing 2 unrelated fragments in a row. Dating had its own trouble. Paleography, dating a manuscript by the shape of its letters, was the main instrument. It works by placing scripts in a developmental sequence. But building that sequence requires manuscripts whose dates you already know independently, and for Hebrew and Aramaic in the late Hellenistic period, there were almost none. The scale was, to a significant degree, calibrated against itself. Radiocarbon dating could, in principle, break that circle. It also destroys the sample. Conservators are reluctant to surrender even a sliver of material, and reasonably so. And when radiocarbon was applied, it carried a hidden defect that took decades to identify. In the 1950s, some fragments were treated with castor oil to make faded writing legible. Castor oil is modern. It is carbon. It contaminates the sample and pulls the result toward a date far younger than the truth. That detail stays with me more than most. For years, a scientific method was returning wrong answers not because the science was weak, but because an earlier generation had done something helpful. And underneath all of it sits a structural problem that no method solves. The institutions holding these objects are custodians, not owners in any ordinary sense, and their obligation runs to people who have not been born yet. Every test that answers a question consumes a piece of the only surviving copy. So the power to authorize a test is, in practice, the power to decide which questions get asked in a given generation. That is not corruption, it is stewardship. But it has the same effect. Some questions wait. The answer, when it finally came, did not come from a scholar of ancient languages. It came from a geneticist. The idea is simple enough to state in a sentence, and it is the kind of simplicity that only looks obvious afterwards. A scroll is not a page. A scroll is an animal. The parchment these texts are written on is prepared skin. Every piece of it came off a specific creature that lived, ate, bred, and died at a specific place. And that creature had a genome, which means the writing surface is not blank. It is a record of species, of individual, of flock, of region. The text on top is the message someone intended to send. The skin underneath is a message nobody intended to send at all. And that distinction is worth holding on to, because it is why this kind of evidence is so hard to argue with. A text can be edited, copied selectively, or written to persuade. The animal it was written on cannot be any of those things. The team that pursued this was deliberately mixed. Oded Rekavi, a neurobiologist at Tel Aviv University, and Noam Mizrahi, a scholar of the Hebrew Bible at the same institution, led it together. Penina Shor, who directed the Dead Sea Scrolls projects at the Israel Antiquities Authority, brought the collection and the authorizations. Matthias Jakobsen at Uppsala University in Sweden brought an ancient DNA laboratory. Christopher Mason at Weill Cornell Medicine in New York brought computational genomics. The practical work fell largely to Sarit Anava, the laboratory manager in Rekavi's group, who traveled repeatedly to Sweden carrying samples released by the Antiquities Authority. In the clean rooms at Uppsala, she extracted ancient DNA from 26 scroll fragments, and as a control, from other leather objects recovered in the same region: sandals, a garment, water skins. The way I read that detail, it tells you how careful they were being. If your method cannot distinguish a scroll from a sandal, you do not have a method. Then came the hard part. Ancient DNA is not a clean signal. It arrives shattered into short fragments and heavily degraded. It is swamped by the DNA of bacteria and fungi that lived on the object for 2 millennia. And these particular objects had been handled by human beings extensively for 70 years, every one of whom left their own genetic material behind. So the work is less like reading and more like filtering. The team used targeted capture to enrich for mitochondrial DNA, the small, densely copied genome that survives better than the rest, which allowed them to identify species reliably before attempting anything finer. And there is something worth noticing about where this answer came from. For 70 years, the questions about these scrolls could only be adjudicated by people trained in ancient Semitic languages and Levantine archaeology. That is not a criticism of those fields. It is a description of a closed system. The only people qualified to check the conclusions were the people who had reached them. Genomics did not respect that boundary. It arrived with a method the existing consensus had no way to argue with on its own terms, and no stake in the outcome. Which is exactly why the results were going to be difficult. The findings were published in the journal Cell in June of 2020. Start with the baseline, because it was not what anyone expected. Almost every scroll sampled was made of sheepskin. Across all the material tested, only 3 species turned up at all: sheep, cow, and goat. And the sheep were overwhelming. That was, in one sense, bad news. If the parchments had come from many different species, sorting fragments by species alone would have been easy. Instead, most of the effort went into a far harder problem: distinguishing individual sheep from a single region whose genomes are very nearly identical. But 2 samples were not sheep. 2 were cowhide, and both of them were fragments of the book of Jeremiah. Here is why that matters. Cattle require grass and standing water in quantity. The Judean desert supplies neither. Raising cows there is widely regarded as impossible, which means those 2 hides were not prepared anywhere near Qumran. They were processed somewhere greener, written on somewhere else, and carried into the desert as finished objects. The scrolls traveled. Then the second result, and this one had a casualty. One of the cowhide Jeremiah fragments had long been assumed to belong to the same scroll as another fragment. It was a reasonable assumption made on the usual evidence. The genetics showed that the other fragment was sheep. They are not the same scroll. They were never the same scroll. Decades of careful reconstruction resting on that join have to be taken apart and done again. I want to be careful about how that lands, because it would be easy to tell it as a story about scholars being wrong. It is better understood as a story about the limits of what the evidence could support. They were not careless. They were working with everything that existed at the time. Then the third result, which is the one that reaches furthest. The 2 cowhide fragments come from 2 different copies of Jeremiah. And those 2 copies are textually different from each other, different enough that specialists had already noticed the divergence. So, 2 versions of the same prophetic book, disagreeing with each other, both manufactured outside the Judean desert, both carried in, and both kept. That is what Mizrahi was describing at the start. Different versions of the same book, in the same place, at the same time. It is worth stating what this does not show. It does not show that the Essene hypothesis is wrong. Rechavi himself has been direct about the limits, noting that the genetic evidence adds to the picture without solving all the mysteries. What the results do is make one specific question, where a given scroll was made, answerable in a way it was not before, and the answer for some scrolls is, not here. There was a fourth finding, and for the larger argument it may be the most important. The Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice is a liturgical work, unknown to the modern world until these caves were opened, describing worship conducted around the throne of God. 10 copies survive. 9 of them were found at Qumran. The 10th was found at Masada, the fortress some distance to the south. The standard explanation for that 10th copy had always been refugees. Members of the community flee ahead of the Romans, carry a scroll with them, and it ends up at Masada. The DNA does not support that. The Qumran copies were written on the skins of closely related sheep. The Masada copy was written on the skin of a genetically distinct line. It was not carried from Qumran. Somebody at Masada, or somewhere else entirely, made their own copy, which means the text was not a sect's private property. It was in circulation. Now hold those two findings together, the traveling Jeremiah scrolls and the independently produced hymn, and consider what they imply about the period. Today, a Torah scroll in one synagogue matches a Torah scroll in another, letter for letter. That uniformity is not natural. It is the product of enormous, sustained institutional effort, and it came later. Before it, according to this evidence, different wordings of the same book circulated at the same time and were stored together, apparently without crisis. Mizrahi's reading is that the very idea of scriptural authority worked differently then, that the arguments between Jewish groups in that period were about what the text meant, not about which wording was the correct one. Standardization requires somebody with the standing to declare one version correct and the others defective. Whoever holds that position does not merely preserve Scripture. They define it, and every group whose copy differs is placed, at a stroke, outside the boundary. Before the temple burned in the year 70 of the Common Era, no authority was in a position to do that. The way I read this, the lesson is not really about a desert sect, because the scrolls are still moving. In June of 2025, a team led by Mladen Popovic, director of the Qumran Institute at the University of Groningen, published a different kind of test. They took 24 fragments that had been newly radiocarbon dated using cleaner techniques and used them to train a handwriting analysis model, one that reads letter forms at a level of detail below what a human eye can resolve. They named it after the Book of Enoch. Then they showed it 135 fragments that had never been carbon dated at all. The dates came back older. In some cases, 50 years older than the established estimate. In some cases, closer to a century. The script style associated with the reign of Herod turned out to be in use decades before Herod. And I would rather give you the uncomfortable number than leave it out. Paleographers judged the model's estimates realistic in 79% of cases, which means that in roughly 1 case in 5, the experts disagreed. That is not a failure. It is what an honest result looks like early in the life of a method. But the direction of travel is consistent, and it points the same way the DNA does. These texts are older, more widely distributed, and less attached to one small place than the standard account allowed. Which means the settlement at the center of the story may have been one node in something much larger, and the collection may be evidence about Jewish religious life in general, not about a fringe. None of this touches the question of whether these texts are true. That needs saying because it is the question underneath the question. The scrolls do not tell you whether God spoke. They tell you how the words traveled, who copied them, where the skins came from, which wordings existed side by side before one of them became the only one. A person of faith and a historian can both accept every result described here and still disagree completely about what the words mean. The evidence is about transmission. It was never about truth. What it does change is a picture most of us absorbed without ever being taught it directly. That the Bible arrived as a single finished object, handed down intact, and that everything after that was preservation. The scrolls describe something else. A period of genuine plurality, multiple versions in circulation. communities that kept variants together and appear not to have been troubled by it. A settlement into a single text that came later and came from somewhere. What stays with me is the ordinariness of it. Somebody in a green place prepared a cowhide. Somebody wrote Jeremiah on it. Somebody carried it into a desert. 2,000 years later, the animal is what tells us they did. Nobody meant to leave that record. That is precisely why it can be trusted. The candle burns low, the questions don't. Until we meet again, stay curious.